Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Jeraffemy Talks, here live on twitch.tv/Jeraffemy and being archived after the fact on YouTube. Ladies and gentlemen, this past weekend, New Japan Pro Wrestling and STARDOM combined forces to bring a historic crossover event that was on pay-per-view on New Japan World. Now, a little bit of disclaimer here, as it were. I've followed New Japan for a long time now. I say not as long as some people, but I would say probably since around 2008, 2010 or so. That was kind of when I first got into New Japan, and from there, I've just got into Japanese wrestling far more since then. As a whole, I love watching things from DDT, Dragon Gate when I can, Pro Wrestling Noah. I really enjoy my Japanese wrestling. Admittedly, I've never had a chance to watch any STARDOM. It's not for any particular reason, I just haven't. And when this show was announced, New Japan Cross STARDOM Historic Crossover, my first thought behind it was, this is going to be a really good opportunity for me to get a taste of STARDOM at arguably one of its highest levels, because the main event of the show was going to be to crown the inaugural IWGP Women's Champion. And that ultimately saw Kairi, who was Kairi Sane WWE, or Kairi Hojo pre-WWE, going up against Mayu Iwatani, two of the stalwarts of STARDOM, as I am to understand it. So, my thought going into this was, this is going to be a great opportunity to get an introduction to STARDOM, to get a feel for what that promotion is like, and the level of action that they bring. As well as obviously seeing some New Japan wrestlers in there, and obviously some unique, literal crossover elements, when there were the men and women involved in the same matches, as it were. So I knew this was going to be a fun show. Probably not show of the year, as it were, but in terms of historical importance, very, very important. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the matches, not all of them, because quite frankly, I don't really have the authority to speak in depth on some of the matches involved. But what I would say is, in terms of it being an introduction, for someone like me, who is very familiar with New Japan, but not familiar with STARDOM, there are parts of this show which were freaking fantastic as an introduction to STARDOM. There were parts of this show which felt really, really bad as an introduction to STARDOM. I thought that the pre-show match Rambo, which was kind of like, in essence, their kind of Royal Rumble type thing. I mean, the New Japan ones at the best of times are pretty much hot garbage all the time. This wasn't very good at all. There was a sort of introduction to multiple people in there, and you got some cool moments. There are some cool moments from people whose names I honestly just can't remember, just because my notes have gone a bit AWOL on it. But I don't think that was a great introduction on there. The other thing as well, which, and I noticed this as I was watching, because I was watching it on a bit of a delay, is that the first half of the show felt like the crossover show. We had numerous matches involving New Japan and STARDOM wrestlers together in the same matches, or there was just a straight-up STARDOM tag, which was really good fun, and there was just a straight-up New Japan tag, which involved the House of Torture. So, in fact, that was the first match on the actual pay-per-view, so the fact the House of Torture was involved in that, it's like, wow, guys, first impression if you're a STARDOM fan, but what the heck. So, yeah, so the crossover feeling was very, very, very prevalent in the first half of this pay-per-view. But in the second half, the only match which felt, well, quite frankly, that had any STARDOM involvement was the main event. There was still some crossover elements because there was Great Muta's final match in New Japan as part of a six-man tag match. So arguably, you could say that's a Noah thing. Arguably, you could say, you know, it's technically someone who's not with New Japan being involved. That aside, the women's title match was the only STARDOM-related match in the second half of the show. I'm going to quickly go over my notes to make sure of that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. But, like I say, in terms of it being a showcase for STARDOM, the level of action that the STARDOM athletes brought, for me, was phenomenal. I got a great showcase of various members of the STARDOM roster. I got an idea as to how intense they can be. I got an idea as to the history between some of them as well. I will say, much as I love Kevin Kelly and Chris Charlton, I don't feel this was the strongest night in terms of them being to successfully introduce me to STARDOM. Now, whether that was by design, almost kind of acting a bit more like an introduction, here are some bits of information to be aware of, here are who are the factions that are aligned with each other, I'm not sure. But there was part of me that kind of clamoured to want to know more about these people I was seeing in the ring, and not just let the actions sort of speak for themselves, as it were. Especially in the main event, there was a lot of context that was added, and in that match, Kevin Kelly and Chris Charlton were on a whole other level, and they actually had one of the Stardom wrestlers on guest commentary with them as well, which that itself was an interesting dynamic, because, now forgive me, I don't know who it was, the person's name escapes me, I think it wasn't Mayu, I'll see if I can find it in my notes as I'm going along here, but they had one of the Stardom wrestlers on there who was adding some thoughts on there, but in the main event, you could tell that she was incredibly emotional. And the English announcers started to pick up on that and almost played into it a little bit, sort of asking her to keep cheering on who she wanted to cheer for, and you could hear the tears literally over the microphone. And that added a whole other level of drama to this I wasn't expecting. And that was really powerful stuff. What they also started doing, and what Chris Charlton started doing, which actually added a really fun, unique dynamic to this as well, was he started speaking in Japanese to the guest commentator, whose name I can't remember, and getting some thoughts and then kind of adding more thoughts as he was going along. And that was actually a really unique dynamic. It's not something I would want to hear in every single sort of New Japan presented show going forward, but it was just a very interesting, unique dynamic there, and it provided something else which you don't normally see, and it made it feel even more unique and historic in many ways. The main event, though, between Mayu Iwatani and Kairi was freaking brilliant. I loved this match so damn much. Ultimately, Kairi getting the win. My first thought was, when it came to who might be able to win this match, was who would benefit most from a global audience perspective, them being the champion, if that makes sense. Who would benefit New Japan the most? My first thought was Kairi in terms of bringing in international fans, and ultimately Kairi got the win. But man, were there points during that match when I was thinking, you know what, they're probably going to go with Mayu Iwatani, because this being my first match of seeing her, I can see why she is one of the people at the top of the Stardom roster. She is incredible. And there were other people on the roster as well who I was introduced to, some of the names of which I may not be able to remember properly here as I quickly glance through my notes. But Julia was one person that really stood out to me. Shuri, I think, was another one as well. I think she was the one... In fact, that was the match earlier in the show. It was Shuri and Tom Lawler against Zack Sabre Jr. and Julia. That worked really, really well. And there were other members of the roster as well who it was really cool to see. And I've heard, for example, so much about Natsupoi, and I got to see a glimpse of Natsupoi in this match as well, in this card as well, when she was teaming with Tam Nakano and then Taichi and Yoshinobu Kanemaru, and also Starlight Kid I'd heard of before, and there were a few other people as well that I got to see. This was a great sort of taster for the Stardom roster, but like I say, in terms of the way the card was structured, the second half of the show just felt very New Japan by comparison, and that's not a bad thing, but when it's a crossover show, I just expected more, and it did kind of feel very, very much a New Japan show at one point. Other match I want to give a big shout out to is the Will Ospreay v Shota Umino match. This was such a fun match to see. Shota Umino has come on leaps and bounds. If you've seen some of his matches while he's been on excursion in the UK, you will know this. But he fits like a glove into the New Japan's, into New Japan. He just fits back in there like a glove. And there was also a really cool historical element to this match as well, because Will Ospreay came out in ring gear that was a tribute to Hayabusa. And Will Ospreay talked about after the fact as well, I think this was also referenced on commentary, but Will Ospreay elaborated on it a bit more, that he actually approached the family of Hayabusa wanting to do a tribute to Hayabusa wearing ring gear akin to what he had worn. And seemingly the ring gear is going to be auctioned off and proceeds given to charity and such. And what the other element was that Ospreay revealed is that not only did he get the family's blessing to do this, it was actually meant to happen earlier in the year, but it ultimately couldn't work out. And this then meant this was kind of the last sort of decent opportunity this year to be able to do it. But the other thing he let slip that he informed everyone about is that this costume was also made by the person who originally made Hayabusa's ring gear as well. So that's just such a cool historical element to this. It was a phenomenal match. Do go out of your way to see it if you can, because it's really, really worth your time. Also, watch the main event, for crying out. I mean, watch the main event. Like, just watch this women's title match. It's so damn good. If anything... Okay, so I've got so many thoughts in my brain. So, I'm going to sort of close out my thoughts, as it were. I'll start to wrap up with a couple of thoughts and questions from myself. The first one being, speaking as someone, as I've said, who's basically never seen any Stardom, but is very familiar with New Japan, did this show get me to want to see more Stardom? Simple answer, yes. I really, really, really want to see more Stardom wrestling. Now, they've got their own streaming service called Stardom World. They've got stuff on YouTube as well. I'm already sort of going out of my way to try and figure out what's the best way to get a taster for Stardom, because with there being so many different streaming services, money can only go so far, as it were. But this was a really, really fun introduction to various members of the Stardom roster, and quite frankly, the level of wrestling that they produce. I was sort of aware as to how high quality and high caliber the Stardom wrestlers were. My god, some of the stuff they were doing was incredible, so I really, really want to go and check it out and get as up-to-date as I can on Stardom and just invest myself in watching more things. In terms of this pay-per-view, because I sort of wanted to watch it partly because, you know, I'm a wrestling fan, this was an historic event, and I wanted to sort of be part of the conversation with it. In terms of, I think that when it came to the value for money and such, it was an extra just over £20, I think. Is it worth the money? I would say yes. Yes, I would. In terms of strictly more as a New Japan fan and not very au fait with Stardom, is it worth the money? I could see some people perhaps not thinking it maybe was, but due to the unique nature of the event, that's what you've got to factor in, and the historic value of this event. The main event alone, and the US title match before it, Ospreay and Shota Umino, is worth the price alone. It's so cool. But the other thing that was really fun about this, and which really added to the overall feeling of the show, is that I got to see New Japan wrestlers crossing paths with Stardom wrestlers who I'm not familiar with, but clearly there's a unique dynamic there you can tell is really fun, and that if I knew more about it, it would clearly mean far more. But there were just little things where I'm just sort of wanting to think, yeah, I want to know more about this. For example, Hiroshi Tanahashi was in a match, and sorry, I'm actually going to look up the names, because I don't want to misremember any people's names here, so bear with me a second. But in fact, I'll mention this now. So I mentioned Julia and Zack Sabre Jr. and Shuri and Tom Lawler. Both had their own different dynamics as teams, worked really, really well. Natsupoi and Tam Nakano and Taichi and Yoshinobu Kanemaru. The fun dynamic of that was that Natsupoi and Tam Nakano are a tag team, and they're kind of more like, again, I don't know for sure, I'm going by what I saw here. I believe they were known as the Cosmic Angels, and they're sort of like an idol pop group in many ways, so that's kind of part of the presentation that they have. And so they came out sort of doing a little bit of a, kind of like a cross-promo routine, if you will, with Taichi singing the lyrics to his songs, and they had a bit of an entrance about them, but Yoshinobu Kanemaru wanted freaking nothing to do with this at all. He was like a fish out of water. It was a really, really, really fun dynamic in that sense. Here we are. So we also had Hiroshi Tanahashi and Utami Hayashita defeating Hiroki Goto and Maika. Goto and Maika were very much sort of dressed in more, I'll say, traditional cultural Japanese clothing, and that was kind of both of their respective presentations. But Tanahashi and Hayashita are both very much like, I think they actually literally said, if Tanahashi is the ace of New Japan, Hayashita is the Stardom equivalent of that. They didn't say it in those words, but that's basically what they said. It just works so well, the pairing, so I can relate in many ways to, even on a very baseline level, sort of where people might be at or what realm they might fit into in the context of New Japan. And I think that's what this show has done, which is very important, is while perhaps not the perfect gateway or entry point into being able to or wanting to watch Stardom in the future, this has given me an opportunity to want to know more about it, having at least some baseline context in there. And knowing, because they were talking about past rivalries and feuds and such, and perhaps people who had matches before that you need to go out of your way to see, it's also given me a base of which to go and check out some stuff relating to Stardom. So if the show has done anything, it has done that. And I would honestly say go out of your way to watch it. I believe New Japan World have said at some point down the line, the VOD will just be available at no additional cost. So if you wanted to wait around for that, you can, by all means. But if you want to be part of the conversation, I think you can get the VOD for another 4 or 5 days on New Japan World if you want to order it. So why not do that? But with that being said, folks, I think that's going to wrap it up here. Again, I'm hoping to be able to watch more Stardom down the line because I want to learn more about it, and I really want to get into more Stardom stuff because that's what this show has done. And that main event, I cannot stress enough, was so damn good. Go out of your way to see Mayu Iwatani versus Kairi. It's so damn good. With that being said, everybody, I'm going to wrap up this review of New Japan and Stardom Historic Crossover. Thank you very much for watching it. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a nice day.